Hello and welcome. We're just going to take a few moments to let everybody enter into today's webinar. So it'd be great if you could use the chat function, the right column there, and just let us know who you are, where you're from, and we'll get started shortly. All right, I think we'll begin now. On behalf of CBIE and McMaster University, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth day of the CBIE Ontario Regional Meeting. My name is Nicole Longstaff. I'm the Manager of Strategic Initiatives for the International Office here at McMaster University, and I'm one of the organizers for this week's conference. Today's feature panel discussion is a very important and timely one. It's on equity and inclusion and internationalization. I'd like to highlight that programming like this wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship, So I'd like to take a moment to thank our session sponsor for today's panel, MoreCare. For those of you who don't know about MoreCare, it's a leading international student insurance provider in Canada with over 25 years of combined experience in the student space. If you'd like to learn more about MoreCare, please visit their sponsor profile on the conference platform. So before we formally begin, I would like to take a few moments to walk you through some of the functionality in the Zoom webinar to optimize your experience with us today. If you're having any trouble with the audio, just to let you know, there is an audio settings on the left bottom side. You can check and adjust accordingly to your needs. And if you are unable to hear from your internal speakers, you do have the option to call in using your phone. So you can click on the switch to the phone audio to obtain the phone number if you need this. So just wanted to let you know that. We do encourage you to engage in the chat. We really want to, one of the purposes of this presentation is to have a discussion. So if you have any thoughts, comments, please engage with us in the chat. We'd love to talk with you. Also, if you have any questions for our panelists throughout today's presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function and put your questions in there. You also have the option to send them anonymously. So you can just check that box if you'd like to send an anonymous question. And finally, if you'd like to see the show live transcript function, there is the CC at the bottom. You can select that and select show subtitle. I believe that is already on right now for you. So anyways, without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce you to our panelists and moderator today. Our moderator and leader for today's discussion is Arig Shaibah, and she is the Associate Vice President, Equity Inclusion here at McMaster University. We have Elizabeth Buckner, Assistant Professor, OIC, University of Toronto. We have Yasmin Razak. She is the Director of Global Citizenship, Education and Inclusion at Centennial College. We have Alyssa Lai, Communications Consultant, former Civic Action Diversity Fellow, and an International Student Alumni from McMaster. We have Anwar Saluji. He is a professor and former Assistant Vice President of International at Ryerson University. And we have Bonnie Ibawa, and he's a Senator William Chair in Global Human Rights and Director of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice here at McMaster University. So I will now turn it over to Arig to deliver our land acknowledgement, opening remarks, and lead us in what is looking to be a dynamic and exciting panel and discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicole, and welcome to everyone. It's just a pleasure to have been asked to both participate and moderate this conversation today. And I look forward to the discussion with our distinguished colleagues. We've invited them to make thoughtful, challenging, and aspirational remarks about the topic today. So good morning, and I'm joining you from Hamilton, Ontario, representing McMaster University, located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The Dish with One Spoon symbolizes the principles of equity, sustainability, and humility. Take what you need, leave something in the dish for others, and keep the dish clean. So these principles are foundational, obviously, to indigenous and collectivist cultures of the global South. And they're very relevant to the topic of inclusive internationalization, which we're going to be discussing today. First, I'd like to pause and pay respects to the families and communities of the over 215 children whose remains were discovered in an unmarked mass grave in Kamloops, BC, and acknowledge the many others who have suffered the violence perpetrated through the residential school system in Canada. So Canadian foundational regimes of colonialism, Orientalism, and even our own history in relation to slavery and segregation in Canada are locally and globally relevant as they have left legacies of anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-Asian racism, including anti-Muslim racism, that must be accounted for in all domains of society, and which we see reverberating across the globe in domestic and international affairs. So addressing such atrocities is squarely in the domain of EDI or social justice education fields, and it's also in the line of sight of international education study and practice. Both EDI and internationalization projects are interested in developing citizens with a global perspective, intercultural capabilities, and a sense of social responsibility. These are not simply skills that are sought after by employers as qualities for success in a global workforce and economy, but they are skills desperately needed for social cohesion and global peace for the future of humankind. Despite the nexus of these goals, EDI and internationalization strategies on campuses have typically traveled separate paths and generally been taken up by people with somewhat distinct ideologies or worldviews. Only relatively recently are we seeing more intentional consideration of the synergies between the two disciplines and priorities. EDI practice is underpinned by critical social theory, which focuses on systemic inequality, structural power differences, and intergroup relations. It addresses micro, meso, and macro level understandings and interventions with an emphasis on the macro. The macro is a non-negotiable tenet with respect to social justice. Internationalization practice is underpinned by intercultural communication theory, which has tended to focus on individual attributes, interpersonal interactions, and intra-group or within-group patterns of behavior. It addresses micro and meso-level understandings and interventions and has been critiqued by social justice advocates for not sufficiently attending to the macro. Although I am familiar with intercultural theorists, Mitch Hammer being one of them, who is looking at ensuring that the macro is attended to. Indeed, as a EDI scholar practitioner, and having worked in 3 Canadian U15 universities in the last 2 decades within the field of advancing inclusive excellence and student affairs, I've observed that internationalization strategies, like other institutional strategies, have not been designed with an equity lens and with social justice goals at the center of those strategies. While internationalization strategies may attend to issues of cultural and national diversity and aspects of inclusion that relate to acculturation and cultural integration, I suggest, and others have suggested this as well, that they have not sufficiently considered issues of equitable access and opportunity, nor sufficiently considered barriers and benefits from an intersectional, anti-oppressive, and global justice vantage point. Within the last decade, the international education field has increasingly begun to study the intersections between internationalization goals and EDI goals. International Association of Universities uses the term inclusive internationalization to refer to a paradigm of internationalization that attends to, quote, equity, cultural diversity, social responsiveness, and mutual benefits, end quote. This paradigm very clearly articulates the need to examine who engages and benefits from the series of activities that constitutes an internationalized and global education, and most importantly, how and why. This examination should fundamentally be about exploring and addressing differences in power structures and relations that create differential barriers and benefits to students, institutions, and countries. The lexicon of inclusive internationalization, like inclusive excellence, makes explicit that which is oftentimes implicitly overlooked in conceptualizations of educational and academic quality that emerge from higher educational institutions founded on Western European, Anglo, and Christian worldviews. It invites consideration of structural and relational power differences in the project to internationalize education. Inclusive internationalization offers conceptualizations of international education that move beyond multicultural and even intercultural frameworks towards anti-racist multicultural and critical intercultural frameworks for more transformative notions of global education. In 2008, Jane Knight wrote, "Internationalization means different things to different people, likely aligned to different rationalizations that organizations have around internationalization." In 2016, Sharon Stein, Vanessa Andrati, Judy Bruce, and Renee Sousa discussed the evolution of these four categorizations of internationalization rationales. And in order of emphasis, they talk about internationalization for a global knowledge economy, internationalization for global public good, anti-oppressive internationalization, and relational translocalism. The synergies between EDI and internationalization lie in the third and fourth rationalizations. So as mentioned, I have spent a couple of decades in higher education. And what I'm observing now as well with this conversation about inclusive internationalization is while the theory is expansive, it's narrower in practice, or seems to be narrower in practice. The conversation on campuses seems to be focused on mobility, the inclusive aspect of internationalization as it relates to student study abroad opportunities. In fact, recently, the Canadian government released its international education strategy and allocated nearly $150 million to be spent over 5 years to encourage three priorities, two of which are related to study abroad: encouraging more and different Canadian students to study abroad with an emphasis on low-income students, Indigenous students, and students with disabilities, and to diversify the destination countries in which Canadian studies choose to study. There are a few ways that the federal strategy, may not sufficiently approach the intended aspirations of inclusive internationalization, and where there may be opportunities to be more expansive in the way that the government might permit institutions to leverage these funds to achieve both economic and equity goals. First, the federal strategy focuses on low-income students, Indigenous students, and students with disabilities, but it does not speak to the full range of minoritized and marginalized students, nor their unique barriers, for which there may not be plausible interventions or easy solutions to overcome, and for whom investments in internationalization at home are critically important. For example, how do we solve concerns about accessibility and accommodation for students with disabilities? How do we solve concerns about personal safety and security for sexual orientation and gender identity minoritized groups? How do we solve concerns about isolation among communally-oriented First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups? In 2014, I had the honor of working with Dr. Cheryl Bond, author of A New World of Knowledge, and with a research team to conduct a survey on study abroad in Canadian institutions. And at that time, we wrote, if we accept that a study abroad experience has the potential to offer students wide-ranging educational, personal, and career benefits, shouldn't the increasingly diverse student population be at least as represented in study abroad as they are in the general population? One might think that to be reasonably assumption, but the facts don't bear that out. And as an example in that study, with respect to racialized students, the study found that while Asian studies appeared to be proportionately represented in study abroad opportunities, Latinx and Black students were underrepresented twofold and threefold, respectively. So the study illuminated the need for individual institutions to engage in what we said was intentional and systematic approaches in order to identify barriers and enablers for varying student demographics, establishing strategies to achieve their desired participation goals, and more importantly, tailoring programs to meet the needs of the faculty, students, and institutional culture. And we recommended that the government plays an important role in developing policies and strategies that provide the sufficient resources for such flexibility and nuance. While the federal strategy focuses on diversification and to some extent access, the social and global equity motivations and rationales are less obvious in their strategic document than the domestic economic motivations and rationale benefits. And this is not altogether surprising. A recently published book, just hot off the press, entitled Inequalities in Study Abroad and Student Mobility, Eva Yanabova and Christopher Johnston write a chapter to map how the term inclusive internationalization has been framed by organizations, and they describe its pursuit as a subfield of internationalization, as well as an important reform movement to counter concerns that some scholars in and outside of the field say focuses on, quote, dangerously centered focus on neoliberal economic goals. Hans DeWitt and Elspeth Jones also write that a, quote, inclusive approach must take into account the varied socio-political, economic, and demographic contexts in which parts of the world and must address the issues that current internationalization policies and practices are not inclusive and leave out a great majority of students worldwide. They acknowledge that credit and degree mobility or student abroad programs leave out what they say is 99% of the world's student population, and they suggest a series of global and local engagements to achieve our stated internationalization learning outcomes, and internationalization at home, or our notions of internationalization at home, feature heavily in their notions of inclusive internationalization. So in conclusion, I'm left with the following questions. How do we ensure that the inclusive internationalization movement is not so focused on an internationalization for all approach that it emphasizes that its emphasis is at the expense of the nuanced understanding of and alternatives to addressing differential barriers and benefits? And also, how do we reconcile and achieve more congruence between our stated campus commitments to equity and inclusion in internationalization and otherwise, in the face of diminishing resources for and investments in campus academic and curricular programs that have historically addressed critical social and global justice learning outcomes? So in other words, how do we ensure that investments in inclusive internationalization holistically consider both local and global engagement strategies? So I hope that gives us a little bit of framing as we continue on our conversation. And I will invite now my colleagues, and first Elizabeth Buckner, to enter into the conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be with you here today, and I'm actually very happy to follow Arig because I think we make a lot of similar points. So I'm a professor of higher education at OISE at the University of Toronto, and over the past few years, I've been carrying out research, a number of studies on internationalization and how it's being incorporated into higher education. So in my research, I view internationalization as just one of many projects or major institutional initiatives that higher education institutions are currently undertaking. And I like to tell my students, you can often recognize an institution's project by whether it has a strategic plan or a working group on the issue. And so we know that one of the other major projects institutions are taking is EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And many institutions actually have strategic plans for EDI, and they also have strategic plans for internationalization. But you'll notice these are often separate documents. And that's because in many cases, these projects have been viewed as competitors for resources or prioritization. And they also come from different traditions and sort of intellectual histories. And only now is this beginning to change, which I think Arig also pointed out. And so we are increasingly hearing calls to combine EDI and internationalization. But in reality, this is easier said than done. And so today I want to talk about findings from 2 studies that my team of graduate students and I have been conducting. And I'm going to summarize my main argument as diversity, yes, inclusion, maybe, equity, no. And so in the first set of studies, along with a team of over a dozen graduate students, we collected 35 internationalization strategies from Canada and another 65 from institutions around the world. And this article just came out in the Journal of International Students. And in it, we explore how strategy documents discuss and also visually represent their international students. And we call that article Diversity Without Race, because we find that strategy documents overwhelmingly discuss international students in terms of enhancing the diversity of the campus, and they use visual images to portray themselves as very welcoming, inclusive, and diverse spaces. But at the same time, these documents almost never discuss race or racism. They're all but absent. And so in that article, we remind readers of the overwhelming majority of international students to Canadian campuses are non-white, and they're coming to primarily white campuses in many cases. And countless studies tell us that international students, as well as racialized domestic students, face racism and microaggressions in class and out of class and on campus and in the community. And so as much as we're willing to celebrate the diversity in the abstract, our official strategies and statements are much less willing to acknowledge the racism and address the harm that it entails. And I think that discussing the reality of both our international students and domestic students' experiences with racism is even more pressing in the wake of the Islamophobic attacks in London on newcomers to Canada, one of whom was a PhD student at Western. And so this brings me to the second point. When our campuses are so clearly oriented to both diversity and inclusion, why does it seem that international students and internationalization activities in general have essentially been forgotten in these discussions? And so in a second study, we've also explored this along with collaborators across Canada. I've conducted a study on the experiences of Asian international students and how they're racialized on and off campus. And in that research, we conducted what we're calling environmental scans at 5 different universities to explore the organizational structures in place to support international students. And in our research, we find that unfortunately, internationalization and EDI have been mapped onto essentially different bureaucratic structures. They often have different personnel and they work in silos in some cases. And so, for example, here at U of T, we find that our EDI initiatives really are rooted in a human resources perspective. That's where they began. And they're still characterized primarily by the lens of U of T as an employer and a workplace, with a focus on legal responsibilities regarding harassment and discrimination, rather than on the student's experience on campus. And so this brings me to my third point. When we talk about EDI and internationalization, the histories of the projects are distinct, and this shapes the extent to which they're viewed as compatible. So EDI itself is an umbrella term that many institutions use for equity, diversity, and inclusion. But these 3 terms actually are quite different. Internationalization is highly compatible with the D, with diversity. In fact, as I mentioned, our strategy documents overwhelmingly discuss internationalization as a way to improve and promote the diversity of our campuses, where diversity often literally means counting nationalities in some cases. The I of inclusion is harder. The intellectual tradition is somewhat distinct. Inclusion originally entered EDI often in reference to accessibility primarily for students with disabilities. Increasingly, it's being reconceptualized and making its way into how we think of internationalization as well, so that we can make sure international students are not just present, but feel fully included in academic and extracurricular life. And some of this focuses on student support services or faculty training, etc. But what about the E, the word equity? We're so far removed from equity that we haven't even really begun to think about what it would look like, is what I would say, especially in reference to international students. And equity in the Canadian context has traditionally meant pursuing justice by dismantling barriers and expanding access for traditionally underrepresented groups in Canadian higher education. This includes rural, first generation, indigenous, students of color, and students with disabilities. And we are beginning to discuss what equity means in reference to outbound mobility and internationalization at home and the curriculum. But we simply don't have an agreement or an understanding of what equitable access would mean with respect to international students. And that is because our current view of the modern nation state, with its provincially supported public universities, we understand that our rights-based equity is essentially bound by citizenship. And so the reality is that our admissions policies and our tuition policies suggest that international students are welcome to attend our universities, primarily to the extent that there is room for them, and they continue to serve the interests of local, provincial, and national communities. And so unfortunately, I think that as we move forward, we'll continue to map international students onto our D&I initiatives, but not our EDI initiatives. And I think this will make us uncomfortable because many of us believe in this broad view of equity. But I argue that if we do want to change it, we have to at least acknowledge that's our current reality and begin to have conversations like these about what might advances towards equity look like, particularly for international students. Thank you.
That was excellent, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. We will move right to Yasmin.
Wow, two outstanding speakers to follow. So thank you both. And so I'm going to begin with a different approach. I work at Centennial College that is made up of just over 22,000 students, 5 campuses, and about 4,500 employees, staff, faculty, admin, and support staff. And so I'm going to share with you the how. How have we integrated inclusive internationalization and recognizing all of the different aspects, themes that both Elizabeth and Arig shared so beautifully this morning. So in 2008, the president introduced a signature learning experience and hired employees to implement the signature learning experience. And I'm going to refer to that as our inclusive internationalization strategy. This had 4 pillars. Number 1 is that we would have a mandatory global citizenship course for all students that talked about equity, diversity, inclusion, and global citizenship, from social analysis to social action. Then we also had the development of inclusive internationalization learning outcomes, 6 of them that were integrated across the curriculum. And we have 7 schools that include schools of communication, media, arts, and design. We have a culinary arts school, community and health studies. We have a school of transportation. We have a wide range of disciplines, but our signature learning experience required that faculty integrate 1 assignment per semester that would speak to the inclusive internationalization outcomes. We called them GCE outcomes. Then there was an intentional pillar. There were 4 pillars. The 3rd pillar on global experience. And these global experience would be developed and accessed through that inclusive internationalization lens. The 4th pillar had to do with the building capacity of our employees to ensure inclusive internationalization strategies were met. And so one of the things that we had to do as an institution, considering we have 134 countries represented, 84 different languages, is we had to first recognize the intersections and break down our historical understanding, as so beautifully put by both Arig and Elizabeth, of what internationalization is and would mean for our students. Looking at those binary terms, international, domestic, and really disrupting those terms through a post-colonial lens, and understanding we have to eradicate those binaries in order to have really impactful inclusive internationalization. And I always say I have the battle scars on my back of integrating these learning outcomes across the curriculum, because it was at that point garnering buy-in. And now we have faculty that are working in schools across diverse curriculums, asking their students to consider the intersections of equity, diversity, and inclusion in architecture, if they are becoming a nurse, if they are becoming a chef, in quite impactful ways. And we do have a team that works with faculty to do so. And one of the ways that we did this is by introducing Betty Leask's internationalization of the curriculum. So what Betty Leask asks is, how is becoming a nurse considered within the nursing discipline, for example? Then we asked, okay, well, how does Centennial College teach that? This is Betty Leask's framework. Then what is the local understanding of nursing? Then bringing it back to, well, what is the national? How do Canadian nurses, Canadian governing body for nurses, understand what nursing is and how it is practiced? And then what is that global context? And so I think what is important for Leask's framework, and what we did is in integrating inclusive internationalization, most notably in the curriculum, is encouraging faculty to challenge the dominant paradigms and disciplinary cultures that surround this. And so what we did is ensure that students and faculty had an opportunity for that critical reflection, to bring in pieces of equity, diversity, and inclusion, again, to build up an understanding of that global approach, global understanding to various disciplines. And we wanted to know how it worked. And so in 2019, we published Innovating Curriculum Integration of Global Citizenship and Equity Education for Student Success. And it was a mixed method study of 627 students. And we wanted to find out, and this is a diversity of students, we really wanted to find out, what was the impact? How did we do? Did we do it right? And the majority of students reported an increase of knowledge and capacity to address issues related to global citizenship, equity, diversity, and inclusion from theory to practice, and how this internationalized learning can navigate across disciplines significantly impacted the role of our faculty. And the findings, the students also indicated that the courses enhanced their educational experience, and over 70% of students indicated that it was useful about learning of themselves. And I do want to touch around global experiences. We did ensure, by offering students, all students, opportunities to participate in our global experiences. And so going back to what Arig said earlier, it wasn't our students from a traditional group participating in our global experiences. It was accessible to all. And in also doing so, we built capacity of our staff prior and post through critical reflection and an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens in order to engage our students prior, during the experience, and post when they got home, to ensure aspects like power and privilege were critically examined, and looking at the spaces in which they were occupying outside of Canada, and when they come home, through spatial theory and other aspects, to ensure that those narratives were disrupted. So one of the things I think is important is thinking about and what we consistently do at Centennial through the building of capacity of our faculty. We recently developed internationalization in a box, and where we have asked faculty to share their stories. And one of the most powerful stories of this module was when a faculty member who was teaching in environmental protection, shared that she gave an assignment. And that assignment was to look at the environmental laws in Canada, how they are not being followed, and what is the impact on the environment when these laws are not followed, and how we can work to address that. And then a student from the Caribbean in her class asked her, you know, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do this assignment, but I'd like to do it from the country I'm in, which was the country in the Caribbean, and how the laws that were developed in the Caribbean were not followed and the impact on the environment. And the professor, through our institutional strategy, allowed the student to do so. And the professor indicated she was overwhelmed by the response, because then she had other students in the classroom that wanted to share the experiences from their own country. This to me is what Killick calls the global academic. How are we building our spaces, our inclusive internationalization strategies that allow for students to engage and that allow for faculty to embrace these ways of teaching and learning? And then I will, thank you, Nicole, I have 1 minute left. And I want to leave with thinking about the ways in which that we operate with Indigenous communities, considering the Indigenous students, Indigenous employees that are at our institutions. And it was an Indigenous employee that made a proposal for the college to consider, if we are putting money on global experiences, to recognize that we are on treaty lands. And if students want to have an experience outside of the college on a different treaty land, that should be considered an international experience. And that was actually adopted by our institution. And now students can go to various places in Canada on Indigenous lands and are funded to do so. So it's really about disrupting our dominant paradigms of how we organize, how we think of these strategies. And I think Centennial College has done an excellent job at really consistently working to do so through a signature learning experience. However, we do recognize that we need to ensure that we integrate the evolutionary discourses of EDI and indigenization to ensure that we remain inclusive for all. Thank you.
It was excellent, Yasmin. I jotted so many notes down. Great, so we're going to move over to Alisa Lay.
Thanks very much, Arig, and it's such a pleasure to hear from everyone else this perspective here. My name is Alisa Lay, and I will say that you've heard from perspectives from people addressing the issues from an institutional standpoint, but I want to layer on the conversation from a perspective of a former international student. I'm a former international student at McMaster University, and I came to Canada 13 years ago on full scholarship from Malaysia. I've reached many milestones ever since then. Graduated in 2012, almost 10 years ago, gained permanent resident status in 2017, bought my first home in 2019, and I'm also employed full-time in the profession that I studied in communications. You could say that I'm the poster child of what one would call a successful international student. Gainfully employed, homeowner, an active volunteer in my community, plus with an Anglo-sounding name, I fit right here, just in Canada. But you and I know not every international student's reality is the same as mine. And that's not because their lack of effort, tenacity, or resilience. I listened into the conversation on Tuesday between international students Joanna Wang, Mark Kamukama, and Muhammad Aslam, who reflected on their education experience during COVID times. In many ways, their comments resonated with me, and I felt a connection to their experiences. At the same time, I was also struck by how much has not changed 9 years since I was a student. As we all know, individual effort could only go so far. We can't ignore the systems, policies, and structures that hold international students back from thriving. And with this lens in mind, I want to share a call to action. 3 things we must get right in order to fully realize equity and inclusion in internationalization. Now, the first one may be a bit unpopular to this group here. Number 1, regulate international student fees. It's no secret that international students pay 4.5 times more than domestic students to study in Canada. And while Ontario froze domestic student fees 2 years in a row because of the pandemic, this isn't the case for international students. According to the Canadian Federation of Students in Ontario, on academic year 2020, the average undergraduate tuition fees for international students were about $32,000 compared to $6,500 for domestic students. With public funding for education institutions diminishing, many schools rely on international students as an important source of revenue, and this is no secret. International students make up fully 25% of student bodies in some institutions, including U of T, McGill, and UBC. International students don't only hold up the school's revenue structure, but they also hold up the economy. Marco Mendicino, Minister of Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship, said, if we didn't have international students, we would have a gaping hole in our economy. They contribute $32 billion to the Canadian economy compared to $19 billion contributed by the automotive industry. In the rush to market Canada as the destination for international students, we lean heavily on the narrative of their contributions to the economy and Canada as a multicultural country of opportunities, a place of greener pastures. All of this may very well be true. However, we disregard how much we squeeze out of international students in order for them to come here. At present, the way public education is set up is inherently inequitable for international students, especially given the dearth of support and lack of steadfast responsibility to ensure that they have a chance to succeed. We must be equipped to provide the right support, which speaks to my second point. Number 2, ensure faculty and staff develop cross-cultural competency to support international students' unique needs. I'm very heartened to hear that a lot of the efforts are underway. By cross-cultural competency, it could mean many dimensions. For one, having a keen understanding and ongoing dialogue about the cultural sensitivities in the classroom and beyond. It's no longer enough to assume that faculty and staff know how to manage and work with students from wide-ranging backgrounds. We also have to remember that the typical challenges that a student may face can be further exacerbated when you're an international student. For example, the student housing crisis has a stronger impact on international students, especially because they're not entitled to work more than 20 hours per week during the school semester for additional income. Plus, the sense of isolation is even stronger when you're an international student. Back when I was a student, I did not like holidays because it reminded me that I had no family to go home to, unlike my Canadian friends. Plus, when you run into problems, you don't always know who to trust or consult in a foreign country and in an unfamiliar environment. Culture shock on even the simplest things. How to turn on the shower and properly toggle between hot and cold, and what to say when Canadians ask you, how's it going? These are the simple things and norms in Canada that many of us here take for granted. And as an international student, you have to learn to be independent very quickly. Learn to treat anything unfamiliar with curiosity, rather than let it debilitate you. But the stress is there, and it's 1,000 paper cuts. COVID-19 stoked the fires of racism and white supremacy. The rise of anti-Asian sentiment and Islamophobia are just some of the many examples of racism that international students have to bear. Many have started exploring and digging deeper on the impacts of pandemic on internationalization. And many schools, including those of you who represent here, have created support structures that address international students' unique needs. However, to me, the clear path forward is to look beyond the towers of academia. This leads me to my third and final point. Our responsibility to enable international students to succeed must continue beyond their time as students. It is irresponsible to bring thousands of international students to Canada yearly, have them contribute to the bottom line of many schools and the economy, and then dust our hands off as soon as they graduate. We need to think long-term, give the necessary support for them to cross the bridge between student life and postgraduate life, and eventually land on the path towards settlement. To make this possible, we must work across all levels of government and with community organizations to identify and address international students' evolving needs, provide wraparound services, and adapt policies on post-graduation employment requirement to the current realities of the labor market. This does mean we have our work cut out for us, but it's worth the effort. Because their success is ours. When international students succeed, we all do. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Arig.
Thank you so much, Alisa. And just to say, I mean, I started off talking about we want thoughtful, challenging, and aspirational comments. And if we didn't say things that are perceived to be unpopular or uncomfortable, we wouldn't be talking about equity. So thank you for your remarks. Enver Saluji, I'll call you up next.
Thank you very much for this. Really, presentations so far have been excellent, and thanks for having me as part of the panel. It's really an important set of discussions that have unfolded so far. So my fundamental guiding principle is that inclusion in education requires equality of opportunity for all students seeking to enter post-secondary education. So to truly value equitable and inclusive internationalization, a post-secondary institution must go beyond recruitment and recognize in its practices that education is a basic human right that ought to be accessible to all segments of our global community, and to create an institutional and an educational environment that is hospitable to those students. For the vast majority of high school graduates around the world, this is a dream that's not accessible, not because of their ability, but because of circumstances and life chances and socioeconomic conditions beyond their control. So I'll summarize my argument as follows. One, inclusive internationalization is a myth. The current model draws on elites who can afford to come to Canada, or it creates huge debt loads for poor families and for students who mortgage their futures to get an education. And it excludes the overwhelming majority of students who would love the opportunity to study in another country. This elitist model then creates intersecting hierarchies nationally and globally, both in terms of our recruitment, where we do our recruitment, and globally in terms of the regions of the world where we have our recruitment because of limited resources and where those resources are allocated for recruitment. So are we recruiting students from the refugee camps of Shaibah or Shatila or Kutupalong in the Cox's Bazar, which is the largest refugee camp in the world? Are we recruiting students from Kakuma in Kenya, or from Zatari in Jordan, or Yida in southern Sudan? Are we recruiting as we are from the elites of the various countries? If the answer is no, then inclusive internationalization is the myth. Are we and our recruiters going into the slums of cities around the world and recruiting students and providing them with the means to attend our universities and colleges? If not, then inclusive internationalization is a myth, and we should simply call it what it is. Student recruitment from abroad that excludes the vast majority of students And we most certainly are not making education affordable for students from the global indigenous communities, let alone for indigenous students from within Canada. Internationalization at home, I would argue, perpetuates a hierarchically ordered two-tiered system of study abroad. Those who can afford to go abroad and experience the richness of being in a new country, new culture, etc., and those who stay in country to experience internationalization at home. And however valuable that is, it's not the same as traveling abroad. And how many of our institutions still practice volunteerism as a credible international experience for our students? So as long as an economic model dominates institutional imperatives in countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, the USA, inclusive internationalization will never be achieved. As long as publicly funded universities and colleges are underfunded, they will turn to alternative sources of revenue, and one of the most lucrative are the fees, as has already been suggested, paid by international students. Yes, we need to ensure our campuses are hospitable and equitable and inclusive for diverse students from abroad and domestically. However, it cannot be overstated that the vast majority of students who cannot afford to come to us, however much our campuses are inclusionary, they are the ones who are on the outside, excluded, looking in. We need to have in place both policies and programs that provide and promote inclusion and diversity, including with respect to anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-homophobia, hate, and discrimination. We need to ensure that international students are aware of their rights, and at the same time, we need to ensure that they are aware of their responsibilities, that they cannot and should not discriminate against fellow students on the basis of gender, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and other prohibited grounds under the Human Rights Code. And I think it's there's an utmost responsibility for universities that we need to ensure that we provide educational workshops on settler colonialism and the historic and contemporary injustices perpetrated against the First Peoples of Canada. So in the post-secondary sector, we need to be fully conscious of the impact of the pandemic on education and in particular on our future pipeline. According to the United Nations, we are now facing a generational catastrophe in education where hundreds of millions of children globally do not have access to education. And this is class-based, it's gendered, and it's racialized, and it is fundamentally exclusionary for many primary and high school students with disabilities. In the post-secondary sector, the pandemic has necessitated the physical closure of universities around the world, except for essential services, of course, and moving teaching online. Within 2 weeks of the declaration of the pandemic, the global pandemic, post-secondary institutions in over 150 countries were closed. And this impacted 80% of the world's student population. In the education sector, generally, the spread of the pandemic necessitated the largest ever closure of kindergartens, primary and high schools, and universities and colleges. By April 2020, the United Nations noted 188 countries imposed countrywide school closures impacting 1.5 billion children and youth. It has exaggerated and exacerbated hunger as children no longer have access to school feeding programs, a number of children living in poverty. It's estimated that an additional 42 to 66 million children would fall into extreme poverty and their families would fall into extreme poverty, adding to the approximately 386 million children currently living in poverty. And the learning crisis and the digital divide only is exacerbated as 1/3 of the world's young people. This is the generational catastrophe that the global post-secondary sector has to be cognizant of, precisely because it impacts future generations who constitute our pipeline. The university sector cannot remain aloof from these critical issues, and central to the reimagined university in the post-pandemic era is a conception of inclusion as part of the global public good. Interestingly, the government of Ontario in 1990 defined education equity as involving the identification and removal of systemic barriers to educational opportunities that discriminate against women, visible minorities, Aboriginal people, persons with disabilities, persons living in poverty, or members of other groups which have been identified as being underserved with respect to their needs for post-secondary education. This is very much in keeping with the definition of employment equity first mooted by Justice Sabella when she wrote, "Equality in employment means that no one should be denied opportunities for reasons that have nothing to do with inherent ability." And to create equality of opportunity, we have to do things differently for different people. We have to systemically eradicate the impediments to those options according to the actual needs of different groups. And she continued, "If we do not act positively to remove barriers, we wait indefinitely for them to be removed." So education, inclusion, and equity refers to the range of activities universities and colleges undertake to attract students, to retain students, to graduate them from institutions. It involves admissions, student support services, what is taught, how is taught, and by whom it's taught. So, three things. Providing access to post-secondary education for those who would otherwise be excluded is central to education equity. Implementing special measures is also essential. Providing the necessary student supports, creating the campus environment, and developing the talents of all students. So three things are essential to this: strategies to increase access for students globally, strategies to make our campus environments hospitable, and strategies to develop inclusive teaching and learning environments. As long as our institutions are underfunded and our model relies on bringing students to our universities, we reproduce these hierarchies of exclusion. Success in dealing with these initiatives, in creating a more equitable, a more inclusive internationalization, will be limited at best unless we reconceptualize and rethink inclusive internationalization, not for the elites, but as equality of opportunity. The answer, therefore, has to be in education, where we take education to students and not expect students to always come to us. This requires us turning the entire model upside down. In today's world, we have the technology to do that, but do we have the political and institutional will to do it? It requires rethinking our financial models. It requires us to rethink the way we do education. And it requires us to be very innovative about taking education to where the vast majority of high school graduates are, rather than the elitist model where we expect them to come to us.
Hello, can you still hear me? I just lost you, Anwar. Can the folks still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Anwar, I think you are coming to the end of your remarks, and we lost you there. They were very rich and compelling arguments, absolutely. So let's turn over to Bonnie then.
Okay, thank you very much, Arig, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. Very interesting, timely conversations. So my comments today come from three perspectives. I speak as a professor who teaches and supervises and mentors students in international human rights. I speak as a human rights scholar and practitioner. And then thirdly, I speak as a former international student myself, having taken my PhD at the Canadian University several years ago. So my comments are directed at addressing one of the questions that frames this panel. And the question says, how do we ensure more inclusive exchange experience for student groups who've been less represented in international mobility programs such as indigenous, racialized students, students with disability, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and mature students. So this is the question I want to specifically address. And I suggest that one way to foster inclusive internationalization and promote global citizenship on our campuses is through the lens of universal human rights. Human rights principles and norms operate on at least 3 levels. You have the provincial human rights regulation, like the Ontario Human Rights Code. We have a national framework, like the Canadian Charter for Human Rights. But we also have the universal and international framework. And my suggestion today is that that universal framework for human rights can provide a framework for building more inclusive campuses, fostering more inclusive internationalization, and ultimately promoting a sense of global citizenship on our campuses. I suggest that universal human rights can be this useful framework, particularly for navigating the political and ideological tensions that are inevitable when students from around the world come to study on our campuses. Apart from the fact that international students bring their cultures, their politics, their ideologies to campus, we see that even domestic students are increasingly engaged in international issues through social media and activism in ways that sometimes lead to conflicts and tensions on campus. And I'll provide just a few examples here. And I'm sure many of those listening today will be familiar with this. So Alesa in her talk has already alluded to the realities of some of the hostilities that international students face on campus, from Islamophobia to anti-Semitism to anti-Asian hate incidents. Most campuses have been closed during the pandemic, but we can all imagine how the anti-Asian hate incidents that have swept across our society during this pandemic would have played out on our campuses if campuses were open. There is no reason to think that our campuses would have been immune from these disturbing hate incidents. I provide a few other examples. Conflicts in far-flung corners of the world often have repercussions for student interaction and inclusion on our campuses. Activism against the oppression of minority, ethnic, and religious groups in certain countries reverberate on our campuses as students pitch their tent for and against perceived oppressive regimes. Debates over sexual orientation, gender identities, and even the use of gender pronouns on campus and how international students engage. It's also an important question, particularly as international students come from diverse social, religious, and cultural backgrounds. These are all difficult questions, no doubt. And how do we engage with them? Very often, educators find these very difficult issues. Sometimes we do not know how to handle them. And sometimes we just wish they'll go away. We pretend they don't exist. But these are the lived realities for international students on our campuses. And I suggest that universal human rights principles, norms, and values can provide a useful framework for respectful, inclusive spaces for these difficult debates to take place on our campuses. International human rights are not only about state obligations to citizens, they are also useful in regulating individual relationships with each other. These are universal principles of human dignity and liberties founded on mutual respect that all nations of the world have agreed to across cultures, politics, and ideologies. And that is the appeal of the universal human rights framework, that we can say to international students, wherever you may come from, these are principles that your countries, your cultures have agreed to. And these are principles that can guide our conduct here on campus. International students in Canada are obviously bound by Canadian and relevant provincial human rights laws. But depending on where they come from, they may see provincial and national human rights norms as either too liberal or too conservative. even if they're bound by these laws. Universal human rights principles provide a level playing field. These are human rights principles that all countries of the world have agreed to. These include, for instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, and lately, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. For those who've been following the debates in Parliament about Bill C-15, you know that there is a debate going on here in Canada to domesticate these Universal Declaration and make it an integral part of Canadian human rights law. There are arguments for and against making that. But Indigenous people have made it very clear that they do want these international human rights instruments to be part of domestic Canadian law. So my argument here today is that these basic universal human rights principles can provide very useful frameworks and orientation resources, not just for international students, but even our domestic students. These are principles that we can all agree on. Each year, my center welcomes several international students who come to study at our center. In addition to other relevant university orientation materials, I present each of my students, postdoctoral fellows or visiting scholars, as the case may be, a copy of this little book. It is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a short document, just about 20 articles. It's as basic as they come. And I tell them that in addition to all the principles that you've been exposed to here at the universities, the policies, student code of conduct, we will treat this document as a universal code of conduct. And I stress that all the countries that you come from have signed onto this document. So we can dispense with the arguments about cultural relativism and as to whether these are relevant to your vision of the world. These are universal framework. There are other things that I like to speak to in terms of internationalization that do not bear directly on these questions of drawing on universal human rights to create a more inclusive campus. And I want to speak to the question of inclusive international education in an era of online learning. I wasn't able to join an earlier session where international students discussed their experiences doing online learning in an era of COVID, but I have a few remarks to make on these questions just based on my personal experience with international students. Many international students who we admitted, particularly from Asia this year, could not travel to Canada, but found that they had to take classes at 2 a.m. and at times 3 a.m. throughout the term. I heard reports of students, international students, whose health deteriorated because they had to stay up throughout the night, 5 days a week, taking these courses. As online learning becomes the new normal, we need to think about this. Even in a post-pandemic era, I envision a situation now where an international student might decide to take a whole term in their home country before coming to Canada, take all online courses. And so we need to rethink how we do scheduling and consider where students are taking our courses from to create that kind of more inclusive environment for them. The other point I just briefly want to talk about before I close is one that I think has not been given enough attention. And I see more and more of this in my interaction with international students. The question of sensitive topics in the era of online learning. International students who have to take courses on sensitive topics online bear a unique risk. Depending on the country where they're taking these online courses from, a politically sensitive course might be a political science course on pro-democracy activism. It could be a socially and culturally sensitive course on gender, homosexuality, and bisexuality. In one case, I had a student got into trouble in their country taking an online course on advanced nuclear engineering at a Canadian university. The focus of this course was nuclear power generation, something quite common. But we've got to recognize that in many parts of the world, nuclear technology still remains a very sensitive political and national security issue. So my question is, what is the responsibility of universities? Do universities have a responsibility to warn and alert international students about the potential risk of taking certain courses online from their home countries? I know that some universities have actually done this. I know UBC, for instance, mandated that certain sensitive courses be flagged and that instructors needed to state very clearly on their syllabus that, if you're taking this course in some countries, particularly countries where online traffic is monitored, you may be at risk. And I had to include that language in my own course on international human rights because we deal with massacres and genocides, which are taboo subjects in many countries. And so I think rather than leaving this to individual instructors, universities have to think carefully about policies that kind of guide how we deal with this. We do not want to expose our international students studying from their countries to risk, sometimes at risk to their lives. So we need to think about the implications of what this will mean for learning in an online environment. So these are the 2 points I really want to stress, the possibility of drawing on international human rights as a framework for creating an inclusive campus, and also the need to rethink some of the traditional paradigms in how we deliver online education, particularly as it relates to international students. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's excellent, Bonnie. Thank you so much. Again, a lot for us to think about. So I'm just going to move us right into audience participation here. We have a couple of questions already in the question and answer section. So please, if folks have something to ask, I see also I'm trying to monitor the chat. So there's the chat and then there's also the Q&A. So from Yukino Mori for Elizabeth, would you be able to elaborate a bit more on your point on how internationalization and EDI strategies are often competing and how international relations officers in particular might be able to tackle this? Any resources you could share would be appreciated, and thank you.
Hi, yes, I'm happy to answer this question. So I would say that when I make the point that they're often competing, I don't mean that the individuals necessarily even see their goals as not aligned, but in the way that projects get institutionalized into bureaucracies often means that, there might be like there are sort of trade-offs between the positions that are created and the staff that are, between personnel, or also like resources, or, when leadership needs to make decisions about what our 3 priorities of the campus are, there's only 3 spaces, and so they're often sort of competing with one another. And there's a number of these big issues that institutions are facing: indigenization, sustainable development, mental health, work integrated learning. Like they're often sort of, not everything gets the same amount of attention. And so one thing that I am sort of suggesting, like, how do we move forward in this, is that as long as they are seen as distinct projects, then they might be sort of competing for resources. But if we are engaging in this type of work, which I think we really are now, is advocating for them to be essentially part of the same effort. And that is a step forward, right? And so instead of saying, okay, your job as the international relations officer is like, here's your scope of work, and it doesn't include the same scope of work that EDI officers might be involved in, to instead say, no, we need sort of the same scope of work in multiple offices, let's say. And then I think that one thing that I would say, just a few other ideas off the top of my head, are if you're working in international relations at the university, like one of the things that I think we need to do better in is, when we're talking about who are our partners, really advancing the point that our partners we cannot choose our partners purely based on like prestige, and we can't only, it's not only sort of the top universities in certain countries, and really taking this more equitable view of our sort of role in the world and our sort of humility in the extent to which we can learn from partnerships with universities in particular located in the global south, not just as capacity building projects, but as actually sort of equal partners in learning, is one of the things that I think we still sort of struggle with. And so those are just two ideas.
That's great, Elizabeth. And I actually had a follow-up question or comment to throw out there, but we'll kind of shift gears and just make sure the audience gets their questions answered. This one's shifting gears a little bit, and it might be directed at our student panelist or former student panelists who identified as international students. So many racialized and indigenous students have described participating in EDI-type courses as re-traumatizing, as students relive harmful experiences of racism and discrimination and are often forced to speak on behalf of their community. If you face this issue, how would you address it? So maybe Alisa and Bonnie can weigh in on this one.
I could provide some thought starters there. Thanks for the question, Marie Rose. I hope I pronounced your name correctly there. I do believe there is a difference between the intention versus the impact. While understanding that the intention is to encourage cross-cultural learning, that in itself is separate from the impact itself. While as much as we would like to learn, there is a point where you have to ask what kind of weight you're putting on the people that directly impacted on this or indirectly. So that's one consideration to think through when there are thoughts or ideas to embed some of this work around this. Supports are available, open dialogue, and recognizing that it is challenging to have conversations like that, and rebalancing the power dynamics when it comes to the room of having these conversations. Because I do think that it's imperative for faculty or staff when they're in the room to set the tone and stage on what the power dynamic is. Because sometimes it comes up in a different way. So for example, if looking back when I was a former international student in my early days, I would be very afraid to say something or voice out a competing opinion because it felt that I didn't have anything good to add because everyone sounded different, everyone looked different than me. So this is an example of unconscious thing that faculty and staff have to remember, and it's really up to the people in positions of power as in faculty and staff to make that clear on the onset and to be very conscious of this nuances in power dynamic and to reset an expectation down on the onset.
So if I could just briefly add to that, I agree with that, but I think this also underscores the need for everyone to be EDI literate and fluent. It's not just a job for the EDI department or the EDI AVP. Everyone needs to know how to do this well. EDI fluency and literacy is a critical skill for anyone who works in higher education. So for instance, we had a conversation recently among academics, professors, and the question was, how do you create that space for the marginalized students, the international students who might not be inclined to speak in the classroom? And one of the ways we've talked about doing this is to create specific periods within the class where contrarian views are welcomed. So this is the time of the class where anyone who hasn't spoken before needs to speak. This is the time of the class where we listen to counter arguments. So if you're making the same arguments that everyone else has made, this is not your time to speak. We want someone to say something that is contrary to what the majority is saying. So building that into the teaching process, so students get to expect that there is a time for those who might not feel included to speak. And I found that sometimes that helps. So we need to begin to think innovatively about how we create these spaces both in the classroom and elsewhere on campus that fosters opportunity for those students who are marginalized, which sometimes include international students, to have a voice within our campuses.
That's great. And you're sort of leading into the next question here about voice and knowledge of international students. So another issue of concern. So Lydia Capariri is asking this question. If anyone else wants to expand on this as well, especially in the graduate student population who come with a wealth of experiences, the lack or limited recognition and use of their knowledge and experience within the university. Can the panelists share experiences with harnessing and meaningfully engaging the experiences of graduate students? And maybe Yasmin, since you've talked about kind of one model of how you've attempted to kind of achieve the aspirational goals of inclusive excellence, are you seeing successes in this regard?
Yes, it's definitely. And I think that one of the things to consider when you are implementing any type of strategies, and I think all of you talked about it, is know where your resistors are and know where to, as you're saying, Bonnie, I really like your point about building the racial literacy, and be okay in that ambiguity and discomfort in order to achieve the goals, and noting that this is not something that has an end point. And so I think it's definitely critical that we understand, not look for, but welcome what the resistance is, and also those tensions within the different contexts, address them, and then, you know, noting that and anticipate them. And I think one of the things that, you know, going back to that last questions, is that we've had students, and I talked about this at our prep session, is that we have had students that have come in with a knowledge base that sometimes supersede, you know, the faculty, because, you know, it's real time and they're coming in, you know, through technology, and they're learning about all these different things. And if we don't have the understanding and creating safe spaces and co-creating those with our students, then it can be harmful. So I definitely think it's something that we have to be comfortable with the discomfort. And when we came up against all of that, when we were integrating our strategies, is pushing through that. But I will emphasize, and I think it's important, I don't know if I did say it, is that this was from the top. It came from the top. It was restated, overstated from the top, supported financially, you know, from the top. And so that also gave power to the people integrating it and support. So that's an important notion.
Thank you, Yasmin. And I see, Elizabeth, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would like to, because it's such an important question. And I think what some of the questions are getting at is like, yeah, how do we do this at sort of the real classroom level? And it's, and, you know, from our perspective, it's very difficult because universities in particular, even more so than colleges, have a great deal of autonomy, and faculty have a great deal of autonomy. So a lot of times when the trainings and the racial literacy, et cetera, trainings are optional, you get opting in to the preaching to the choir. And yeah, exactly like Yasmin's saying, who are the resistors are the ones who are sort of opting out, right? And so it is so great when it is, you know, if it's really a priority from leadership, that's one thing. But then I think that one of the issues that we're facing, I'm just speaking from my own personal experience working, you know, at a graduate institute, is that faculty also have so many competing demands on their time. And so even the best intentions of doing better by our international students in our teaching and our pedagogy and our curriculum comes up to sort of confront the reality of publication pressures and tenure and whatnot. And so a few of the ideas that what I think we need to get at is, how do we institutionalize change? Because it can't, you know, it is true that it's great for individual action, but for example, we have a Center for Teaching and Learning at U of T. That's an excellent resource that will come and sit down with you and as a faculty member and go through your entire syllabus and help you think through how you're organizing your instruction, but I've never, they sort of haven't yet, as far as I know, been called to help faculty think about like whether their syllabus is like too white, you know, and whether they're actually like citing scholars from the global south, even though that is a stated intention of the university, for example. And so I think that making better use of some of the practices that are already in place around maybe like course evaluations and using those tools as a way to ask our students whether they feel like they're sort of actually sort of included and their minoritized opinions are actually given space, and then actually disaggregating those experiences by status, international or domestic. Or we don't do that, you know, we don't get access to that data even to sort of analyze our own courses and whether we're doing right by our students. And so these are the types of sort of practices that there's not going to be an easy answer, but thinking through like how do we institutionalize these commitments is sort of, I think, the next step.
Can I quickly respond for 2 seconds?
Yes.
And that was what we did is, I mean, we had this institutional mandate, and the first year we did well, but what happened is when we put it in our quality assurance processes, which is called CPQR, for those that don't know, this was required for our academic leaders to work with faculty to ask the very questions that you're stating, Elizabeth. And I think that that's really important, is that if we didn't have those existing processes like curriculum review, and then disrupting that by adding the different questions around inclusive pedagogy and inclusive internationalizations, we would have never known if it was done. And then we had to report on that. And so I agree with you, and just from someone that did it in practice, it has to be built within these processes of quality assurance or of class climate, which we did, in order for us to really determine if it was being done and how effective, and ways we need to change. So great point, just wanted to share, thanks.
That's great, thank you. And I'm going to sneak in a question here, but I also see there's a couple of questions about resources. I would suggest that folks Google our presenters, and I'm sure you'll find some links to the work that they're doing, maybe even some contact information that they can point you to resources, the work that they're doing. I wanted to ask if Anwar, in the last few minutes, to pull you into this conversation. It seems to me there's two streams of the conversation. You know, the optimism, potentially, the cautious optimism that we can have some incremental integrative change in the way we've conceptualized internationalization and inclusive internationalization. And then there's the, you know what, we got to throw this out and reform and be transformative, and not sure if we are incrementalists, we're actually being complicit in advancing a kind of a neoliberal agenda. So Anwar, your last few minutes to you.
So the tough question comes to me is that,
yes, yes.
Why not? Since I was the one out there saying it's a myth, and I do firmly believe it's a myth. I think we really do need to think about the way in which universities and colleges can reach out to those populations that would never, ever be able to access our universities. So how do we actually do that? I think, first of all, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because international education is very important. I think universities have an obligation to take education to where students are. And by that, I mean, let's find ways. And for example, at Ryerson, I have recently been involved with setting up a campus with partners in Egypt, so that we can reach down into the next tier of students who can't afford to come here, but who can, from the region, go to New Cairo, where the campus is being set up. And I think that's really important to do, because now we're going to reach thousands of students who are in the next tier, who can't afford to come here, but can afford to either access education from the region or stay in New Cairo, where it's considerably and infinitely cheaper than staying in Toronto, for example. So I think we need to be creative about that. Secondly, I think Bonnie's points about the sensitivities with respect to online education notwithstanding, I think we have an obligation to think creatively about synchronous and asynchronous online learning and take to those students and ensure that our universities can make that kind of education affordable to students abroad. Let's take online education into the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar or in Dadaab or in Shabra and Shatila. Why not? Now we're reaching a segment of the population, and the cost to a university is not that great, right? And the last is around credentialing. Let's look at ways in which we can work with domestic universities about micro-credentials, about cross-fertilization of our degrees, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think, and I'm noticing the time, and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, but the one thing is that, I mean, the COVID pandemic has let us know that the answer to can we is yes, we can, but it's will we, right? Will we? So I think this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all. I'm passing this over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Arig, for moderating this incredible discussion. Truly brilliant comments from all of you, and to our audience for all of your amazing questions. This is such an important topic that we all need to think a lot about, and a lot of work to be done in our respective areas. So I really appreciate the frankness of this conversation. On behalf of CBIE and McMaster University, thank you for attending. I do encourage you, we have a couple more days of programming to the rest of today and then tomorrow as part of this, our CBIE Ontario regional meetings. So I encourage you to go in the platform and see some of the additional excellent programming that we have left. And I hope that we can continue these types of frank conversations, and more importantly, that they lead to actual action in our institutions to make things more welcoming and truly inclusive. So thank you all.
Have a great day, everybody.